The Devonian period, often called the Age of Fish in Earth's history, is characterized by an evolutionary radiation in some fish groups, including strange jawless fish and armored placoderms. Equally significant was the great increase in the diversity of plants, which spread from the coastlines of the continents across the land and created new terrestrial ecosystems, the world's first forests. During the late Devonian, there were major changes in oceanic geochemistry, with periods when the oceans became depleted of oxygen. Rapid plant diversification may have enriched rivers with high levels of nutrients that were then carried to the seas. Because reefs prefer low nutrient conditions, this may have contributed to a decline in their diversity during the Devonian mass extinction. The global climate was generally relatively warm, arid and dry, and the overall equator to pole temperature gradient was less than today. The Devonian was the time when the land turned green. From the small land plants of the early Devonian came to tall forests of later periods, and with them came animal inhabitants, including invertebrates. But this period was a time of change in the marine realm, culminating in the late Devonian mass extinction. The plants of the early Devonian were small, vascular, and generally leafless, although some had scale leaves like those of club mosses living today. The simple plants of the Devonian were confined to damp environments, although by the late Devonian a greater range of habitats had evolved and a number of animals appeared, including spider-like arachnids forms, flightless insects, myriapods. Many invertebrates colonized the new, tall tree environments that were the precursor of the great Carboniferous forests. Throughout the Devonian the globe cooled slowly. Representatives of several invertebrate groups, such as trilobites, gradually disappeared in stages through time, due to a combination of environmental changes. Before the end of the Devonian there was a dramatic catastrophe, the second of the Great Five Phanerozoic mass extinctions. The causes of this are still much debated. Sea levels had risen, but there is also some evidence for changes in ocean currents that may have disturbed stagnant bottom water and poisoned the upper waters of the sea. There is also increasing evidence of multiple meteorite impacts around the time of the extinction event. Heliophyllum was a rugose coral that lived in the oceans more than 385 million years ago. As a fossil, it is normally found singly. Its skeleton, the corallum, is conical, although slightly irregular in shape. There are fine growth ridges on the outer walls. The shape of Heliophyllum's corallum indicates its growth history. Decreases in its diameter are the result of environmental stress, and bends reflect changes in growth orientation. The soft-bodied coral polyp would have lived in a shallow concave cavity at the top, known as a callus. Calceola was a small, solitary rugose coral. Its fossils are roughly semicircular in cross-section and the corallum or skeleton is often slightly curved. In life, the coral would have rested on the curved side of the skeleton, with a soft-bodied polyp sitting in the callus at the top. A lid-like structure, the operculum, covered the concave callus. This could be drawn closed by muscles contracting, so that the polyp was totally enclosed and protected when it was not feeding. Hydnoceras was a vase-shaped glass sponge that lived in the oceans between 385 and 360 million years ago. Seen in cross-section, it had twin walls, one inside the other. The inner wall surrounded a large central chamber. Like living glass sponges, the body of Hydnoceras had a skeleton made up of numerous similarly shaped structures known as spicules, made from silica. Hydnoceras' spicules had 6 rays, each ray forming an angle of 90 degrees with the next, so that every spicule looked like a cross with a vertical bar running through its center. Some large outer spicules are visible on Hydnoceras, forming a surface pattern of squares. Inside each square are smaller squares. Plorodictium was a tabulate coral that formed small dome colonies. The base of a Plorodictium colony was flat or slightly concave, and this is seen in its fossils. The individual coral animals, or polyps, in a colony were relatively large. Their skeletons are clearly visible. The corallites had thick walls, which grew in contact with one another. They were perforated by many tunnels. Within the corallite, there were numerous dividing ridges, rows of spines, or spiny ridges. The corallites themselves were large and short. Phillips astrea was a colonial rugose coral. Its individual corallites did not have separate walls, and vertical partitions from neighboring corallites were shared. The septa varied in length. Many were long and curving, but others were very short. complete and incomplete horizontal partitions were present at the center of the corallites, where soft-bodied polyps were located. Small, horseshoe-shaped plates were found in zones surrounding the center. Tychomaltochia was a small rhynchonellid brachiopod, a group that can be identified by the nut-like shape of their shells, and usually, strong ornamentation. Both valves are convex, although the smaller valve is more inflated than the larger valve. The pedicle valve has a prominent beak and a small pedicle opening. In life, this opening housed the pedicle, a fleshy stalk that anchored the animal to the seabed. The entire shell was ornamented with strong, radial ribs. Mucrospirifer was a spiriferid brachiopod with an unusually long hinge line, the widest point of the fossil shell. The hinge line runs between the two valves, coming to a point at each end. In the center of the smaller valve is a clear, V-shaped fold. There is a corresponding infold on the shell's larger valve. On either side of the brachial valve's central fold, there are strong radial ribs. The ribs themselves are crossed with growth lines. The grout H-lines are far stronger near the lower edge of the specimen shown here, suggesting that there was a pause in growth late on in this brachiopod's life. The strange-looking Soleclemenia was one of very few ammonoids with triangular coiling. The whorls in its concave shell barely overlap, resulting in a wide and shallow umbilicus at the center of the coil. The whorls are ornamented by densely spaced ribs. Soleclemenia was a member of a group of early ammonoids that evolved in Europe or North Africa. Fossils from this group are distributed only in these areas, and only in the late Devonian period. Unlike other ammonoids, they're siphuncal. The internal tube that connected the living shell to the earlier chambers migrated from the ventral of the shell to the dorsal during early growth. Murchisonia existed on Earth longer than almost any other gastropod genus. A period of more than 200 million years. It was a sea creature that fed on algae and similar marine growth. Murchisonia's shell was the only body part that fossilized, and is notable for the spiral ridge, known as the slit band, that runs around the center of the whorl. This ridge can be traced forward to a slit at the edge of the mouth of the shell, a feature shown by many primitive gastropods. Chyloceras was a small goniatite. Its shell was tightly coiled, with a small, navel-like hollow, known as the umbilicus, at its center. The coiling of its shell was involute, meaning that the inner coils were hidden by the outermost one. In cross-section, Chyloceras was somewhat flattened. Around the whorl were irregularly spaced constrictions, almost as if someone had pulled a serting tight around the shell and left an impression. The significance of these constrictions is unknown, although it has been suggested that they may represent short periods of restrict growth. The shell also had faint ribs running around it, much less visible in Chyloceras fossils than in those of many other ammonites. The suture line was gently curved. Cupresicrinites was an unusual crinoid, exhibiting perfect FIEV-sided symmetry in its cup. It had 3 circlets of plates in the cup at the end of its stalk, a feature that helps in identifying its fossils. Its arms were flexible and were used to remove tiny particles of F. Ood from the water. In fossils, the edges of the arms have articulation points for the small pinnulesed filament-like extensions that gathered food particles. Although the pinnules themselves are never visible, the arms were massive and could fold over the cup, presumably to protect it either from predation or from fine sediment flowing onto the grooves within it. Where food from the arms collected, the stem was roughly square in cross-section with a central canal and 4 peripheral canals along its length. These are visible in fossils where the stem has been broken. Phacops was one of the most characteristic trilobites of the Devonian period. Its headshield was dominated by a large bun-shaped central raised area known as a glabella, which in many species had a bumpy surface. The eyes, which were located close to the back of the glabella, were large and crescent-shaped. They carried large individual lenses arranged in a hexagonal pattern across the surface and can easily be seen with the naked eye. Outside, the ida cheek fell away at a steep angle. The hypostome, a broadly oval structure, lay beneath the front part of the glabella and was rigidly attached to the rest of the headshield at its front end. The thorax had 11 segments and the tailshield was smaller than the head, with 8 or 9 well-defined segments on its axis and 5 to 6 ribs on the flanks defined by deep furrows. Paraligerus was a trilobite with a crescent-shaped headshield and a glabella that widened dramatically at the front. Its eyes were located toward the back of its head and its cheeks were broad without a defined border and ending in a sharp angle on the sides. The thorax consisted of 10 broad segments and its fan-shaped tailshield was markedly longer than its headshield. Paraligerus belongs to a group of trilobites with distinctive fan-shaped tails which might have been used to propel the animals through water. Leoharps was a trilobite with a large horseshoe-shaped headshield. Its conical glabella occupied a little more than half its length. Its tiny circular eyes lay opposite the front of the glabella. Break time equals 0.2 s, greater than on the inner part of its smooth cheeks. The outer cheeks sloped steeply to the edge of a broad, flat fringe. This had a large number of tiny pits, and extended backward into a long, broad dagger-shaped spine. Its thorax had at least 28 narrow segments, and its tail was small. The headshield of Leoharps is of quite high relief, and this may have been related to its function as a filter chamber for feeding on small particles of food. Often called the Age of Fish, the Devonian saw a major radiation of fish groups both in marine and freshwater environments. By the late Devonian, the stage was set for an invasion of the land, with the arrival of the first four-legged vertebrates, the tetrapods. Devonian seas teemed with life, and a wide variety of fish evolved and spread around the globe, including the first true sharks. Jawless fish, such as the osteostracans, were the first to explore estuaries and lagoons and were followed by jawed predators, including placoderms and the sarcopterygians. It was the sarcopterygians that gave rise to the first vertebrates to venture onto land. Tetrapods are four-legged animals, and include amphibians, reptiles, birds and mammals. The earliest known tetrapods appeared in the late Devonian about 365 million years ago, in the form of Acanthostega and Ichthyostega. They are assigned to the class Sarcopterygii and evolved from the lobe-finned fish. Recent research has established that the fish most closely related to the tetrapods is Tiktaalik, whose fossils were found in 375 million years old rocks in Canada. With Panderichthys, they have flattened skulls and dorsally placed eyes, similar to Acanthostega. One feature links Tiktaalik more closely to Acanthostega is that the head could be moved more freely. Panderichthys retained the fish-like connection to the shoulder girdle. Originally, it was thought that tetrapods had 5 fingers and toes when hands and feet evolved from fish fins. However, Acanthostega has 8 digits, while Ichthyostega has 7, indicating that the number of digits was variable and only became fixed to 5 later in tetrapod evolution, in aditio. And, the idea that tetrapods first evolved when they lumbered onto the land also proved to be incorrect. The fossil specimens of Acanthostega and Ichthyostega were found in rocks in Greenland that were clearly deposited in a river environment, indicating that these early tetrapods lived in streams or small rivers. The fossils are well preserved and nearly complete rather than being disarticulated, indicating that these animals died and were buried very close to where they lived, rather than being transported any great distance. Also, their paddle-like limbs were more suited to swimming than walking, and Acanthostega had a fish-like tail. Although they both had lungs and could breathe air, they retained internal gills. It seems that tetrapods in the Devonian were gradually adapting to the final transition from water to land. Their conquest of the land would not be completed until the Carboniferous. Although the outline of Stethocanthus was similar to that of modern sharks, there are striking differences. The tail fin is almost symmetrical. In modern sharks, the upper lobe is usually much larger than the lower lobe. The pectoral fins had a long, distinctive rod, called the whip, which trailed behind the fin. A third distinctive feature is the large structure projecting from its back, sometimes called the ironing board. Because of its shape, its upper surface was studded with a dense patch of denticles. Tiny, tooth-like granules embedded in the skin. The only other place denticles appeared was in a patch on the head. These features, probably present only in males, may have been important for gripping females during mating. A primitive heterostracon, Weigeltispus, lacked both jaws and paired appendages. The body scales, which were largest behind the single pair of brachial openings and smallest on the tail, bore a complex surface ornament. The substantial tail fin suggests that Weigeltispus was likely to have been a relatively strong swimmer. The fin web was interleaved with at least 5 horizontal, scaly, finger-like projections, which would have aided propulsion. Weigeltispus was a relatively small fish that lacked the spines seen in later genera. It was probably a plankton feeder. The jawless pteropods can be divided into 5 families, including Protopterospididae, to which Protopterospis belongs. This somewhat unspecialized fish had a narrow, rounded snout that was less elongated than those of many related genera. It also lacked the large, rear-facing projections, called cornua, that extended back from the side, just behind the single gill opening. Like its relatives, however, Protopterospis did possess a medium-sized dorsal spine. The plates covering the headshield had concentric, serrated ridges of dentine. The headshield formed at an early age and grew by addition to the plate edges. In adults, these plates fused together. One of the earliest known Ps amostiid fish, Deponospis, was small compared to its late Devonian descendants. Its flattened headshield featured a mosaic of SMA. Scale-like plates that separated the midline plates from the paired ones on either side. These small plates appeared as the fish matured and were entirely absent in juveniles. Its flattened shape suggests it was a bottom-dwelling fish that foraged on the ocean floor. However, it is unclear how it fed because its jawless mouth pointed upward. Drepanaspas had no fins other than the ones on its tail. Xenospis was a large osteostracon with a horseshoe-shaped head, which is also seen in the more primitive Atelespis. Xenospis differed from Atelespis in having long narrow cornua on the head, and the lateral sensory fields were also somewhat narrower. The rear edge of the bony headshield was drawn up into a central crest that continued as a row of dorsal ridge scales then formed a single dorsal fin toward the back of the body. The pectoral fins were smaller than those of Atelespis and had narrow rather than broad bases. The mouth lacked teeth and instead was lined with elongated oral plates. These merged into the scales covering the chamber that housed paired gill openings. It was a bottom dweller that lived in shallow seas or river mouths. The heavily billed armored Lunaspis lived in the shallows of a sea that covered parts of Europe 400 million years ago. This distinctive flattened fish had plates that were heavily ornamented with concentric rings and separate head and trunk shields linked at a rudimentary hinge joint. The median dorsal plate of the headshield was very long and extended forward as far as the backs of the eye sockets, which were on the top of its head. Because the jaws have not been preserved, little can be said of its diet, but its flattened shape suggests that Lunaspis lived on the seabed. Rigid pectoral spines projected about 45 degrees from the body and extended to the back edge of the trunk shield. Instead of a dorsal fin, Lunaspis had 3 large ridged scales behind the median dorsal plate. The rest of the body was covered with bony scales that decreased in size toward the fish's tail, which appears to have been divided into 2 equal parts. A flattened fish with large wing-like pectoral fins, Gemawandina, was a bottom dweller with a shape similar to modern rays. Its eyes were on the top of its head, greater than, with nostril openings between them, and it had a wide mouth. 2 large plates, the submarginals, covered the gill region on its sides. The only other identifiable plates on the head were the suborbitals on the front and outsides of the eye sockets and the perinucleals, which carried sensory canals. The bony covering of the cranium had no distinguishable plates. All of these areas were surrounded by a mosaic of small plates called tesserae. They extend beyond the opening for the narrow-based pectoral fin. The pelvic fins comprised small, semicircular flaps, while the dorsal fin was reduced to a single dorsal spine. The anal fin was absent, and the tail, like the body, was long, tapering, and covered in scales. Larger tooth-like scales were also present, randomly scattered over the fins. Probably the best known of all arthrodires, Caucasteus was first described in 1841, after which 49 species were identified, although many were later reclassified. This armored fish had large pectoral, dorsal, and tail fins and a powerful tail, suggesting that it was an able swimmer. The 2 pairs of tooth plates in the upper jaw initially had teeth, but these were gradually worn down by contact with the lower jaw to form sharp, blade-like cutting edges. Stomach contents reveal that Caucasteus was a predator of both the Canthodians and juvenile arthrodires. It may have lain in wait on the seabed and ambushed prey using its tail to power the attack. Caucasteus had a long, tapering spine on the median dorsal plate and many other smaller spines on the underside. Known from a single complete specimen and a few bond fragments, Rolfisteus was a bizarre, long-snouted fish that lived among the reefs of Western Australia. The rostral plate was greatly elongated, forming a tapering tube that comprised half the length of the headshield. The function of this tubular snout is unknown. It may have been used to expose buried prey on the sandy seabed, or to provide better streamlining so the fish could hunt shrimps living near the surface. Rolfisteus had flattened, crushing tooth plates at the back of the mouth, suggesting that small crustaceans and shellfish formed at least part of its diet. The snout could also have been a sexual characteristic of males that was used for display to attract females during the breeding season. Dunkleosteus was a heavily armored fish, but its armor did not enclose its pectoral fins at the rear. This development allowed the fin base to increase in length and aided mobility, suggesting that Dunkleosteus was an active hunter in the shallow seas in which it lived. The upper and lower parts of its trunk shield were connected only by small, non-projecting spinal plates. Its lower jaw and front upper tooth plate eventually wore down, leaving fang-like points. Dunkleosteus lacked ornament in most species, but its plates often bear bite marks and puncture wounds, indicating that, despite its size, it was itself hunted. This huge fish had a massive blade-like lower jaw and upper tooth plates with sharp shearing edges. It could open widely when taking hold of prey, its gape aided by the unarmored space between the head and trunk shields. This early antiarch had a somewhat clumsy appearance. It had a box-like trunk shield with almost vertical sides and a flat bottom. The roof may have varied among species. The pectoral appendages were not fin-like, but were gently curving spine-like structures, covered with small body plates. Tetrapods was a small, heavily armored fish with distinctive pectoral appendages, not unlike Bothriolopus in appearance. However, the head-to-trunk proportions were different in that Tetrapods had a longer body and relatively smaller head, and the pectoral appendages were shorter in length. Having its eyes on the top of the head suggested that Tetrapods was a bottom dweller. The body behind the armored parts tapered and was covered with overlapping cycloid scales. The single dorsal fin was triangular and was supported anteriorly by large arrow-shaped scales. Characanthus was a freshwater fish. An active swimmer, it patrolled the middle depths of lakes and rivers, feeding on small prey items caught in its gaping jaws. It had no teeth, so presumably it filtered water through its long gill rakers to extract food. Characanthus had large eyes, a large mouth, a deep body, and an upturned tail. One of its defining characteristics is the lack of intermediate spines on the belly. Each fin was protected by a spine on the anterior edge. Its scales, which were small, non-overlapping, and ribbed, have been found at many sites. Fin spines, which were loosely attached to the body, have also been discovered. Complete specimens are preserved only in the old red sandstone deposits of Scotland. Aeschynacanthus had stout teeth that were larger toward the front. There was a whorl of smaller teeth where the two jawbones met. This freshwater lakefish was slender and streamlined and had well-developed fins. The spines, which were long and narrow, are found only in association with fins. There were no intermediate spines. The armoring of the head and shoulder area is reduced compared to some earlier acanthodians, making Aeschynacanthus capable of quick maneuvering while hunting or fleeing capture. The body is covered with small, polygonal scales, and the tail was shark-like. A ray-finned fish, Charolopus is the most primitive member of the Actinopterygian group known from complete specimens. It lived in shallow lakes that existed about 380 million years ago and had a long body covered in tiny interlocking diamond-shaped scales containing ganwan, a substance similar to tooth enamel. Its pectoral fins were fleshy and more like those of a modern lungfish. Charolopus was probably capable of swimming at high speeds to catch its prey, which it trapped in the many sharp teeth that lined its long jaws. The length of the jaws suggests that it could open its mouth wide and take in sizable food items, possible up to 2/3 of its own size. Stomach contents have revealed a diet of fish, including its own kind. Lungfish were widespread and diverse in Devonian times. Early forms were found in coastal saltwater sediments, but by the late Devonian they had moved almost exclusively to freshwater. Dipterus had a well-armored head, the top of which was covered with a mosaic of small bones. Some bones carried lines of pits that may have had a sensory or nutritional function. There was a large pair of tooth plates in the upper and lower jaws, across which ran rows of robust teeth that were probably used for crushing shellfish. a large plate covered the gill chamber, suggesting that gill breathing in lungfish was more important in Devonian times than breathing air. Named after Point Florent in Maguasha National Park in Canada, Florantia was an early lungfish. Its snout was longer and more slender than those of modern forms, and it also lacked the robust tooth plates that are typical of many lungfish species. Instead, it had rows of conical teeth and small denticles. The body scales were large and round and lacked cosmin. Florantia's largest fins were on its back. Like Dipterus, it had an anal fin, long, thin pectoral and pelvic fins, and a heterocircled tail. The body was deep and laterally compressed, which suggests that it was a fast swimmer that hunted prey rather than foraging along the bottom. M for food. Florantia lived in fresh or brackish water. Holoptychius was a large fish that was a dominant and clearly very successful predator. Its remains have been found throughout the late Devonian in several parts of the world. The main type of fossils that are found are sheets of large, bony scales, preserved as the body of the fish disintegrated. A single Holoptychius had long, paired fins, rimmed by a fringe of fin rays, and its skull had a joint across the top of its head that allowed the snout to be raised even further when the mouth was opened. It lived alongside fish such as placoderms, on which it may have fed, and it also ventured into some of the same habitats as the tetrapods. Panderichthys is one of 3 known Devonian fish that show man-transitional, tetrapod-like features. Compared to other tetrapodomorph fish of the time, it was more flattened top to bottom, and compared with most other fish, it had a longer snout and large eyes placed close together on the top of its head. Similarly, the rear part of the skull that covered the ear region and brain was comparatively short relative to the snout. The hinge joint across the skull that was present in many primitive tetrapodomorph fish was absent in Panderichthys. It is likely that it breathed air using a lung-like air bladder to a great extent, supplementing the use of its gills for respiration. Panderichthys retained fin rays on its paired fins, and scales all over its body, but fins on the back and tail were absent or reduced in size. The skeleton on Eusthenopteran exhibits clear evidence of the link between fish and land vertebrates. It was a late member of the Tristichopteridae. The small bones at the base of the pectoral and pelvic fins of Eusthenopteran can be traced to the bones, by now greatly enlarged, of the front and hind limbs of early tetrapods. The structure of its vertebrae and its skull, especially the nostrils, also link this fish to the tetrapods. Long before modern scanning techniques and computer analysis were available, the details of Eusthenopteran's skull were obtained using a more painstaking method. A fossil skull was ground down, millimeter by millimeter, and several photographs were taken at each stage. The sequence of images was used to make replicas of every thin section of skull out of slices of wax. The fossil was destroyed in the process, but the complete wax model produced allowed scientists to study the fish's skull, inside and out. Osteolopus is one of the best-known early members of the tetrapodomorphs, the group that gave rise to the four-legged tetrapods. It was one of the first Devonian fish to be discovered and as a result lends its name to the Osteolepididae, an extinct family of lobe-finned fish that are a sister group to the Tristichopterids. Its fossils are common in the Middle Devonian rocks of Scotland, where it lived in a large, shallow lake known as the Orcady Basin. Its bony scales and skull bones were covered with a kind of glossy, enamel-like substance called cosmin. Cosmin was full of pores, which are thought to have been the openings to a sensory system for detecting water currents around the fish. Osteolopus's skull had a mobile joint across the top of the head, which allowed the fish to open its mouth very wide. Osteolopus lived alongside many other kinds of fish, including the lungfish Dipterus and several placoderms. In many respects, Tiktaalik is a fish that shows even more tetrapod-like features than Panderichthys. For example, Panderichthys has a series of bones that joins the skull to the shoulder girdle. These is also a series of bones that covers the gill regions. These bones are absent in tetrapods, and most of them are also absent in Tiktaalik. At least, they have never been found, and many of the tetrapod features that Tiktaalik does share with Panderichthys appear to be at a more advanced stage in the transition to land vertebrates. It has an even longer snout and shorter rear portion of the skull than Panderichthys and a wider round notch at the back of the skull. Acanthostega is a famous Devonian tetrapod. It had 4 limbs that ended in 8 fingers or toes, but it also had some primitive features such as fin rays along both the top and bottom of its tail. Acanthostega had a well-developed gill skeleton, so it probably used its gills for respiration as well as having had an air bladder for breathing air. The ear was similar to that of other tetrapods and included a stapes. In fish, the equivalent bone is involved with operating the gills. The limbs do not look like they were capable of bearing Acanthostega's weight and were probably used a paddle. It was probably an ambush predator that lived in shallow rivers. Ichthyostega was the first Devonian tetrapod to be discovered. Its fossils come from rocks in East Greenland, and it lived at the same time as Acanthostega. Ichthyostega has many unique features that have puzzled paleontologists for decades, but new research is clarifying some aspects of its structure. Its ear region, for example, appears to have been adapted for hearing in water rather than in air. Ichthyostega certainly spent some of its time in water, but its vertebral column seems to have been adapted to a form of terrestrial locomotion. Its body was encased in broad, overlapping ribs, which together with its robust shoulders and forearms, suggest that strong muscles were used to pull the animal along on land. Its paddle-like hind limbs were better adapted for swimming.